For some universities, alumni are their former students. But as an alumnus of the University of Pretoria, you're part of our family from the moment you start your journey with us. The pathway that you follow on your journey at UP is paved with striving for excellence, perseverance, adaptability, getting it right the first time, and reaching the finish line. UP is home to many of South Africa's shining stars. You're part of this family, a family that knows the value of hard work, integrity, passion, creativity, and innovation. You're always able to come back home and reconnect with your family all around the world. The UP Alumni Connect app gives you unique access to opportunities like mentorships, careers, and invitations to selected events. Reconnect with us, keep in touch, be proud of your home and your family, and continue to make a difference.
Dear esteemed guests, colleagues, alumni and viewers everywhere, very good evening to you and welcome to tonight's installment of the LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership Conversations series. I am Sebenzile Nkambule, a communications practitioner and our moderator for this discussion. Tonight's conversations topic is A Dream Under Fire. Is South Africa a failing state? Some of the topics we will chat about this evening include how many, if any, of the warning signs of a failing state South Africa is currently showing, some of the key issues and factors that characterize the current dispensation and how the country reached this particular point, and what are some of the steps that can be taken to stem the decline and steer the country away from failure so we may see it on the rise once again. Let me now hand over to the VC, Professor Tawana Kupe, for some opening remarks.
Good evening to everyone joining us tonight, alumni, students, colleagues, members of our extended University of Pretoria community, joining us in person at the Future Africa Institute at UP's Hillcrest campus, and those of you joining us online. Tonight's fourth installment in our 2022 LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership Conversation series is perhaps the most critical for South Africa, both in its topic and its timing. Our topic, of course, is A Dream Under Fire. Is South Africa a failing state? And this important conversation takes place as political realities continue to shift dramatically and South Africans from all walks of life continue to bear the weight of dysfunction by a state that is widely perceived to be failing its constituents. As many of you will know, the Alumni Thought Leadership Conversations were conceptualized as a way of giving UP-affiliated experts, including members of our 300,000 strong alumni community and our UP academics, a platform on which they can share their expert opinions on the most important issues facing our country, continent, and the world. Tonight's event marks the 24th panel discussion organized by our Alumni Relations Office in just over 2 years. It is always a great source of pride to me to be part of these discussions and welcome some of our expert UP alumni back to campus and onto our shared University of Pretoria platforms. In our quest to be a leading research-intensive university on the African continent, I am grateful for the support of our staff, students, and our alumni body in the ongoing work of translating our research into real-life activities that change and improve realities for people around the world. UP remains an agent of change in our community and beyond, means embracing the increasing necessity for transdisciplinary research and collaboration across institutions, whether other universities, research institutions, civil society groups, business, or government. This collaborative imperative is another reason the LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership Conversations have become an important fixture in UP's calendar of events. Tonight's panel is said to be comprised of 4 speakers, of whom 2 are alumni of the University of Pretoria, 2 are staff members, and 2 are highly placed and influential players in the worlds of business, finance, and government. This commitment to gathering experts and tackling top-of-mind topics that are shaping our country, continent, and the world in real time is yet another impactful way in which UP takes research and the world of factual debate out of the so-called ivory towers and relates it back to the real-life issues that affect each of us in different ways. Tonight's central question of whether South Africa is a failed state, whether the country is showing signs of becoming a failed state, whether we're already failing in failed systems, is an urgent discussion we must not shy away from having. This is important so that we can take a factual approach to where we find ourselves as a country, so that we can heed any warning signs and implement the corrective measures needed in order to steer our country back onto the reparative democratic path we chose in 1994. As we continue to grapple with the after effects of colonialism, apartheid, and state capture, and with the governing party's elective conference now just weeks away, it is perhaps even more important to air these issues so that our leaders across all political parties might assess where we stand as a nation and be armed with the best facts available as they take important decisions that will shape South Africa's immediate and long-term future. Of course, as a professor of media studies and literature, I want to remind our audience and any members of the media who are joining us that there were early warnings of state capture from our independent media. As chairman of the board of Amabungan, the investigative journalism unit, I was witness to the team publishing stories on the nefarious influence of the Guptas through, among others, the Gupta email leaks and other stories. Although society should have taken heed early on and prevented what is now a cancer, the publishing of those stories is a stark reminder of the importance of casting light onto our problems and state failures, of open, healthy, and constructive debate, and even criticism. I look forward to our panelists and audience contributions, and I'm sure it will be a robust debate that will hold our leaders and all of us to account. Thank you for joining us, and may this discussion provide you with food for thought and hopefully some encouragements as we continue to strive for the better country and world we dream of.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor Kupe, for your welcome and insight. Of course, this event is brought to you by the University of Pretoria's Alumni Relations Office. And among our panelists this evening, as the VC already shared, we have two who are UP alumni. And let me present our panelists for this evening. Professor Sandy Africa is the Deputy Dean of Teaching and Learning at UP's Faculty of Humanities and is also the past chair of the expert panel on the July 2021 civil unrest. We're joined online by Professor Danny Bradlow, who is a professor of international development law and African economic relations at the University of Pretoria, who's also an alumnus, having completed his LLD at UP. We're also meant to be joined, in fact, by Ms. Busisiwe Mavuso, who is the CEO of the Business Leadership South Africa, BLSA. However, she has since, of course, had to pull out as a result of a bereavement in the family, and we send through our condolences to her and her family. Finally, we are privileged to be joined by Mr. Dondo Mkhajane, who was the Director General of the National Treasury until just the other day, in July of 2022. We welcome our expert panelists and thank you all for your time this evening and of course agreeing to share your thoughts on this big topic. And just before we dive in, I'd like to just ask those who are watching who'd like to join in on the online conversation to please use the hashtag LeadUP Conversations when you are posting about the event. After round or two of questions here, we will then open it up to questions to both our in-person audience and of course our audience that is joining us online. So let's kick off. We ask a very big and a complex question this evening. We're asking, is South Africa a failing state? And how did we reach this point? And let me ask our panelists just to give brief high-level opening remarks about what this question evokes and what your thoughts are. Professor Africa, let me start with you. Good evening and thank you for joining us. Your thoughts on this question.
So good evening, and thank you very much to the University of Pretoria's Alumni Office for the invitation. Yes, indeed, a very big topic, a very complex issue. And I think for that sake, I would urge us to actually unpack the concepts before diving into the debate. I think that there's much media debate, much public commentary. And in a space like this, perhaps it just helps us to step back a little and interrogate some of the concepts which are used when we talk about the challenges that we are facing. And perhaps as a political scientist, when I hear the concept failing state or failed state, my mind goes back to the context in which this labeling arose, at least in international relations. And the context was, in fact, one in which, after the collapse of the communist world, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the imposition, really, of a single model of what the rest of the world should look like, what the world should gravitate towards, when states appeared to not be conforming to the model of democracy or governance or what a constitutional framework should look like, there tended to be a dismissal or a labeling of such state as starting to fail. And particularly when coupled with this, there were deficits in relation to what these state systems were doing or failing to do in relation to their citizens. Now, I don't want to become too pedantic, but I do think that there's a history to these concepts and that we should be very careful about how we use them. But indeed, we live in an international context where states do have certain responsibilities. They do, therefore, bear an amount of accountability for what they do or fail to do in response to the needs of the people they are meant to serve. And so in that sense, the generic argument around whether or not they are failing is a valid question, but I think it's very important to frame it in a particular way. I often think it's, apart from looking at this through the lens of whether, we are facing governance challenges, I think it's also perhaps pertinent to ask whether, in fact, our state, the South African state, is in the kind of crisis, because that's the argument which we are hearing increasingly, that there is, in fact, a crisis of such monumental proportions that if something very dramatic and drastic does not happen, we could all but witness the collapse of the state. So those are just a few, perhaps, conceptual pointers that I'd like to start off with as we enter into the debate.
Sure. So failing is not necessarily the wrong word. We just need to understand what we mean by failing or failed.
Absolutely, yes. And I think perhaps we ought to unpack that. I do think that issues of whether the state is adequately representative, whether it enjoys legitimacy, whether it enjoys authority, and whether it is responsive, are some of the indicators that we can use to make an assessment of whether the state is in fact failing in small letters or not.
Sure. Let me welcome Mr. Dondo Mokajane, and I think myself and a number of us may perhaps urge and call you DG during the course of the evening, because it's your stepping down was quite recent. Your opening remarks, high-level thoughts on this question we're asking this evening.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite and to the Alumni Association for inviting me. I think I agree with Sandy right up front. What we need to do is to firstly understand the concept. What is a failed state? What is a failing state? what characteristics can be attributed to failed state or characteristics to a failing state. And one Italian diplomat, senior diplomat, once said, we have to be, when we talk failed state, it evokes a sense of hopelessness, and it also in some sort of despair. And we have to be very careful and use this word very sparingly, because if we throw it out there, we may be losing it. I'll tell you why you invited me to the panel. Let me start there. You invited me to the panel because in around February, March of this year, at a conference by Deloitte, the post-budget conference, I then said, South Africa is beginning to show signs of a failing state. I didn't say at the time that South Africa is a failed state. I said we are beginning to show signs of a failing state. And I then described what I meant. I used two examples. I said, look, when the state or the state machinery has ceased to take its citizens seriously in its confidence, and also when the state is on a high, I remember saying, if us as public officials at the time, including politicians, that's what I said, are on this high horse, and we forgot, we tramp on the downtrodden and the poor, and I said that's a sign, because we've forgotten what the state as an institution should be, and because the same people that we are tramping on, because we live lavish lifestyles, politicians and public officials and DGs, etc., and they'll feel a sense of despair will kick in, and hopelessness, and hope, and once that kicks in, then, we become to be jittery. And secondly, I said when we are beginning to show basic, signs of not caring about what we are for as government and provision of basic services and so on. So it's not that they cease to exist, but the resources are there, the budgets are allocated, but no one is doing anything about it. So that distinction is important as a start to define what is a failed state and what are characteristics of this failed state. South Africa is not a failed state because our levels of education, basic functions, education, health, etc., there's governance, there's institutions, the courts, the legislature, the executive, all of these are in existence and they are there and we know. So we're not failed in that in some cases, some states that have failed, these services are not provided for. And secondly, when you go further and ask yourself, are we showing signs of a failing state? And I said, yes, we are showing those signs. And later on, as I was asked to explain what I meant, because I got a whole lot of flagging from various quarters, I said, look, if I go, and I give two examples again, I said, if I go to Klerksdorp, one of the municipalities, and all the intersections in the city or in the town have got huge potholes, because I just happened to be in Klerksdorp the weekend before I said this. I said, when I check the municipal infrastructure grant, there's money and allocations are made. But when you ask why are contracts not awarded, it's because Sandy and Dondo are fighting as to who should be getting the tender. That's a sign. Resources are there, but it's, again, so I'm talking rent seeking also kicks in. It's a big sign. And I said, when also signs of a failing state, and I gave the second example, and I said in Bloemfontein or Lekwa, and at the time, those were the topical issues that were in the newspapers at the time. In Bloemfontein, you had an incident where you had two municipal managers, two CFOs, and you had the current political party in power, even after the local government elections, and you had the ANC factions fighting among themselves to a point where there's dysfunctionality in the municipality. The council has not set at all, and the same in Lekwa and many other municipalities. And then I said, those are signs that we are going towards a failing state. I changed a little bit. I said we are showing signs of a fate towards a failing. We are not failed, but if you are not careful, we are going there. where citizens will rise against us as a state, and those are some of the things I think are important too. So those are my opening shots. South Africa is not a failed state, but we are showing serious signs of a failing state.
And we'll get to talking about state capacity in just a bit, and of course how we protect these institutions, and unrest as well in just a moment. Let me invite Professor Danny Bradlow, who is joining us virtually. Good evening to you, Prof. Your thoughts, high-level remarks on this question we're asking this evening: is South Africa a failing state?
Good evening, everyone. And thanks to the UP Alumni Office for inviting me to participate in this event. I think for starters, my co-panelists, Professor Africa and Mr. Mokhojani, have laid a good basis for this. I agree with them totally that South Africa is not a failing state. I think we have a number of strengths which should be which were mentioned and should be recognized. The judiciary is still functioning and is respected. I think our elections are viewed as legitimate. People might be losing faith in the outcomes, but they view the process as legitimate, and that's important. I think the importance of free speech, which Professor Coupe mentioned, is also an important issue. I think none of us on this panel or in this audience worry that whatever we might say tonight could lead to us being arrested or suffering some sort of a reprisal. And that's an important issue to keep in mind. I think the universities that we have function well. They provide the services, the research, etc., that they need. But I think there's an important distinction which we should make also between being a failing state and having a failing government. And that the government is a political body. The government, I think, is failing to deliver the services that we as the public of South Africa expect. As Dondo said, the failure to deal with potholes, the failure to deliver proper services, the breakdown in primary and high school education are signs of failing governments more than of failing the state. So I think the state remains an important and relatively vibrant institution, but the governments might be failing, and we should keep that distinction in mind. I think also it's not just the government that is failing. If we look at other sectors of society, we can say that there are problems there as well. Business is not as transformed as it should. It's not delivering the jobs as it should be delivering. It's been a participant in the corruption that we've seen over the last decade. Labor is not necessarily delivering services that it should to its constituents or to the broader workforce. The high unemployment is an issue that we have to take very seriously, the rising unemployment. I think all of that are important signs of challenges, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that in many ways, if you look at our peer countries, other developing countries that are at similar levels to South Africa, they have many of the same symptoms. And that's certainly not a justification for us failing to deliver what we should, but I think it's important for giving perspective. If we compare ourselves to countries which are much richer and have much greater resources and have been democracies and functioning states for much longer than the short 30 years, almost 30 years that we've been a functioning democracy, it's not reasonable to expect us to be able to deliver what they're capable of delivering. So if we look at countries like Brazil, Colombia, Thailand, we're not doing as badly as it might look. And so I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about whether we're a failing state or not. So I think for all those reasons, we should celebrate the fact that we do have legitimate structures in the state. Our institutions, while not perfect by any means, are vibrant and have resilience. But we should acknowledge that there have been many shortcomings, and that the issue is more a question of are the political structures, the government, the business institutions, the trade unions, civil societies, are they functioning as well as they should? And how do we make sure that they function better in the future? I think I'll stop there for my opening remarks.
Quickly, thank you, Prof. Bradlow. On just your point about failing government, would you make a distinction, or do you talk about failing government speaking broadly about both national government, local government, provincial as well? And of course, there's always that discussion whether or not we even need that middle layer, the provincial government. But do you draw a distinction between how local governments perform versus the sort of issues that we see at national level?
I think we do have to draw a distinction. They are different, and I agree with you. There's a question as to whether all the provincial structures are absolutely necessary or they could be refined in various ways. But I think the test that we should be using is probably the same for both, which is, are they delivering the services that they're supposed to people? I mean, as in Dondo's example of potholes in Klerksdorp, that suggests the Klerksdorp municipality is not doing its job. But on the other hand, at national education or national health, that's a question for the national government as well as provincial government. So the test might be the same, but I think we have to apply it in different ways at different levels of government.
Mm. Prof. Africa, let me come back to you. You were the chair of the expert panel that closely looked at the July 2021 unrest. That particular incident, I think we don't talk about enough. Still, it surfaced issues around intelligence, policing, failures in policing. It showed how many communities, in fact, remain quite vulnerable to attacks. We saw ugly scenes in terms of vigilantism. And then, of course, right, the influence of online mobilization of groups. In your view, and from, of course, the work that you did on the expert panel, what would you say are some of the complex issues that led to that devastating tragedy last year?
Okay, thank you. And I just want to say that I speak now in my personal capacity because the panel presented a report to the president and a series of processes took place, and there is a set of implementation measures which are being rolled out. But indeed, if one reflects back, if one thinks of these indicators that I was talking about, which define what a state ought to be able to do, at least in the political science literature, it's often said that the state enjoys the monopoly of the use of force. And that's one thing that defines a capable and effective state. And this is not to say that that force would be used against its own citizens. In fact, it's actually classically expected that the state should be able to protect its citizens from external aggression, and of course to police its own environment so that citizens and people within the state, in fact, not just citizens, everyone who happens to be within the state is feeling safe. Now, perhaps we backtrack a little here because that report indicated that there were indeed failures. So I suppose if you want to be objective, we have to admit, and perhaps this is a matter of debate, that yes, we may be on the trajectory of failing and are not yet a failed state, and we may want to debate that. But certainly there are instances where there are failures which have catastrophic impacts, as did that unrest, where over 350 people were left dead. Everything else, quite frankly, pales into insignificance compared to that loss of life. But very often is cited the fact that the economy lost over 50 billion, and of course, many people's livelihoods were affected. People lost jobs and businesses, things that they'd built up over a lifetime. So to the question of how we got to that brink, I think you've stated it. I think that it was, in fact, a combination of the fact that people, in any case, were living in such a vulnerable state of existence. On top of that, apart from their poverty, unemployment, all the degradations that they suffered, there was the COVID pandemic. And it took just an incident or a set of circumstances to trigger a set of violence, and this included, among the triggers, the online agitation. So for me, the lesson there is just how fractured, in a sense, our society is, because it did not have the resilience. Those cracks, and those cracks take the form of the social imbalances, the inequality. Those cracks could be so easily exploited, with the results that people's lives were lost. So it does point to the need for much more ratcheted up development to take place, but also, I suppose, a different kind of political culture to take root, so that the political competition that is unfolding very often violently is replaced by something else, which accepts. And I think we are lucky in that we have a very robust political culture, but the fact that it is tipping very often towards violence is one of those signs of starting to fail. In my view, we still have great incentives for people to play and to contest within the formal political spaces, but who's to say what could tip us into that sphere where conflicts, civil war, and ongoing violence with the state, as we saw in those instances of those 8 days in July, does not have the capacity to intervene. We could actually find, if we do not have robust development measures on the one hand, but effective law enforcement and a robust criminal justice system on the other hand, all in the context of political competition and political rules of engagement, we could in fact find ourselves in a spiral of violence. But I think we have the foresight, we have the ability to step away and to find an alternative path, as we have had the experience many decades ago of just how catastrophic this can become. And I think that at least our constitutional framework does afford us the opportunities to address some of these ills.
It almost feels like we're waiting for the next one, for the next unrest, for more lives to be lost, for more property to be damaged before we actually step up. In your view, do you feel that what transpired last year shook us enough that we are in fact doing something about it?
I think that this takes us to the question of what kind of state are we? Yes, in fact, there are the formal measures, the program that has been put in place by the government to address some of these weaknesses, and they say they are filling posts, they are building up capacity, they're improving coordination, and indeed, in the subsequent weeks and months, we were told there had been efforts to destabilize that were thwarted, but you're standing on a very weak leg if that's all that you are doing. And so I would have been happier to see a massive rollout of development programs, a massive rollout of economic intervention measures, a convening of civil society and business and government actors that really took stock of what had happened and decided collectively what the way forward was. And I think that you're still seeing a situation where civil society is on the margins of decision making, when in fact it should be quite central to it. And I, for that reason, think that we need to reconceptualize governance, need to reconceptualize decision making, and place the resources in the hands of those who can make those changes. Now, this may sound idealistic, but these are the hard conversations that we ought to be having. How do we do governance and government differently? Because it would seem that there are some weaknesses in the way in which we do it at the moment.
Yeah. Former DG, let me bring you on this point. I think it's a good point to jump in on. Great question there from Prof. Africa about how we do government differently. We saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, money was found, right, for the emergency that we were facing as part of course, the global community, whether it was the 350 rands to support people, PPEs, and of course the scandals that emerged from all of that. But essentially, we needed to do things in an abnormal way. Is that sort of thing practical going forward, recognizing that these pressures that many people are facing continue? Just tomorrow there'll be a protest from workers in public service because they're not happy about wages and so on. And on a daily basis, working class people are protesting, whether it's over power or any other services. Can we, and how does doing government differently look in order, of course, to avoid yet another July 2021 unrest?
Look, I think for me it's important. Education is important. Educating society around how government is funded, one, is important. Where government finds money, because there are only two sources. You can either pay taxes, increase taxes, then we get money. And secondly, you can go and borrow money. And if your economy is performing well, more people pay tax. That relationship is important just as a basic. And that there's no factory somewhere at the Reserve Bank building to print money, because then there's counter, very, very, serious implications just to print money for the sake of printing. We saw recently with many examples around the world. So firstly, educating people is important. Secondly, we are a small country. We are a very new democracy. 30 years, 25, 30 years is very short in the bigger scheme of things. We have not, most of the arrangements have not been institutionalized in the way we do things. Our fiscal policy, trajectory is still in its infancy stages. You may think that every time we come up with brilliant budgets in February and around medium-term budget like we did the other day, but it can only be a function of what's available in the kitty. Yes. And what kind of appetite do you want to take, whether you want to increase the deficit and at what levels, what is your debt to GDP trajectory that is acceptable by the markets to actually live with it, because the cost of borrowing will be influenced by all of these decisions that you make. But however, if there's an understanding that firstly, money doesn't grow on trees, then we can make the right decisions. It's one thing to just make available 350s for everyone, or some basic income grant for everyone in South Africa who doesn't work. But someone must understand where the money comes from. In an underperforming economy, it means you must borrow money from someone. So if your fiscal policy, and we did say, by the way, it's been like that for many years, but whether we live up to it is another thing. We said our fiscal policy is anchored on fiscal sustainability, intergenerational equity, and obviously, debt sustainability. Those three aspects. So we were okay to say debt to GDP of 30, 40%. It used to be, by the way, just before the financial crisis, less than 30%. Because of the global financial crisis, we took a wrong decision. We had 70 billion rand, I remember that particular year, around 2009-89. And then we entered into an unsustainable, I'll still call it an unsustainable wage settlement. And we wiped that 70 billion rand surplus in one go. But we have to sustain that moving forward, because you cannot reduce people's salaries the following year. And yet the economy is not doing very well. What did we do? The intergenerational equity and fairness, we forgot about it because of the decisions and the political choices that we made at the time. Child support grant used to be, eligible criteria was what, 13 years or something at the time, we increased it. It means we put more billions. Fast forward to COVID, after COVID, We all know the impact of COVID. We know that COVID impacted both the rich and the poor, negatively. But then, what did we do? I'm not saying it's a wrong decision that we took, but we just simply decided. And now we're even talking of making this 350s permanent and even increasing it when the economy is actually not doing well. So we are burdening future generations. That intergenerational equity and fairness policy stance that we thought we are agreeing on and we are agreed on as a country, we put it out of the window. Debt sustainability, look, we cannot sustain ourselves. If we keep on increasing on the expenditure side and on the revenue side, things are not coming together nicely. Be sure you'll have to borrow more. And that's what we're doing now. We're doing that. And a little bit that we got with the tax revenues that we got, we started paying off debt and so on. We did well. But again, that balancing act is going to be a difficult thing. Now, tomorrow, as you correctly say, I'm not arguing against wage increases. But I'm just saying, let's be practical. I'm always saying, and that's why I'm not a unionist, by the way. Because one of my degrees early on in my early life, I studied industrial relations, and I said, this is not me. I just left. After obtaining an honors degree in that, I said, no, this is not me. Because the reality is that I get a sense that sometimes, especially in the government system, in a factory, you must produce more cars to make more profit, and then you can argue with labor. You can sit and say, this is where we are, this is our balance sheet, and so on. Now, if we do that in the state, in government, then it's difficult. Labor doesn't understand, but they need more. We will say it makes sense to give maybe an inflation-linked increase, but they always want inflation plus and other benefits. What do? We have to borrow because there's no money. So it's important that we understand and educate ourselves and educate, and have difficult conversations with the unions. The unions in my previous life were very angry with me because I was upfront and I was direct in the way I was arguing these things. And I remember 2 years ago, we put a 57-page affidavit on why we are not going to afford the last leg of the previous wage settlement. I did not celebrate after winning in the court. The court ruled in our favor. But I didn't celebrate because it was not about winning or losing or pitting against them, but it was the principles that we were arguing around the economy and the performance. But again, it's an unfortunate thing that the demand is going to be unsustainable, some that we cannot sustain. But reasonableness is also very important. And if I was still in the system, I would still appeal directly to Treasury and to Labor to find each other and understand on these matters. And what then should we do with the money that we have? Should we be building or boosting productive sectors of the economy? I'm saying yes, in order to grow more jobs, in order to grow more resources that will actually come in the form of taxes. And then we can do anything that we want to do when we've got enough.
Professor Bradlow, you've written quite a bit about the debt crisis on the African continent. Give us a sense of what it looks like and how this crisis stalls the economic growth prospects of a country such as our own.
So the first point to stress, I think, is that South Africa does not face a debt crisis. It has, as Donda suggested, constraints on financing and on what it can afford, but it's not facing a debt crisis like countries in Africa. So according to the IMF, almost half the countries in Africa are either in debt distress or in debt default. And most of that is because many of them have debt denominated in foreign exchange, where most of South Africa's debt is denominated in rands. The challenge facing all of Africa, including South Africa, really is a huge tragedy, because in addition to the existing needs of meeting the requirements of the current generation, we're facing the challenge of how do we adjust to climate change? How do we adapt to the fact that we're now, as a continent and as a country, facing the twin problems of flooding, droughts in different areas, the fact that because of geopolitics and the war in Ukraine, food prices are going up, energy prices are going up, and all governments are working out how do we have to deal with that in this environment of constrained resources and debt crises. So that creates serious challenges for South Africa, even though we're not facing a debt crisis, but we are facing those other crises because it affects our ability to trade with the rest of the continent. So for the economy to grow and benefit from the opportunities being created, for example, by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we're constrained. We're not able to benefit as much as we want. And we should add that in the countries around us, in the SADC region, Zambia, Mozambique are already in debt crises. Zimbabwe is probably in a debt crisis, certainly in debt distress and not growing. Angola was threatened with a debt crisis, but because the oil price is now high, they're doing better. But it means that the countries around us are suffering terribly from the current situation. And that creates pressure for migration. So in addition to the trade problems, South Africa becomes a magnet for people from those countries looking for jobs and a way to support themselves and survive. So all of that creates problems for us as well. It suggests to me, because I think if we look around the world, it's hard to see where solutions come from. The environment is not conducive to big flows of money. I mean, we can see what's happening now currently with the $8.5 billion that South Africa is getting or has been offered by the countries in Europe and North America for dealing with the just transition related to climate and energy. The $8.5 billion, most of that is loans, so it's not particularly generous in the first instance. And secondly, it's a drop in the bucket of what we actually need to make the transition that we all know we need to make. So that all suggests we need to be very creative in thinking, how do we use the resources that we have, and how do we tap into existing resources around the world in a much more creative way. And I suppose if you're putting the most positive spin on things is to say that that's an opportunity, that we can begin to think about ways that might not have been possible a few years ago. I have a proposal for how to deal with African debt that's called the Dove Fund, which is the debts of vulnerable economies. And it's saying we need to have a way of restructuring the debt of African countries that are consistent with a set of principles that will produce more sustainable and inclusive growth, but also help us access financing both from the public and the private sector around the world. I think that's one way. The other way is South Africa needs to become active participants in the debates currently taking place both at the current COP negotiations, but also will take place in the next few weeks in the G20 around how to deal with the multilateral development banks so that they're able to lend much more money. Because even though we know there are many problems with those institutions, they are the most important sources of money for many countries in the African continent. And we need to make sure that the money is more readily available and is available in a form that is more usable by the countries in the continent.
We're going to do a final round of questions, and I'll open it up to the audience. So please start thinking about your questions so that we get to that quite quickly. But Prof, just staying with you, speak a bit about where South Africa's, I suppose, voice is currently globally and also on the continent. As you've already alluded to the president speaking yesterday or the day before in Egypt at COP 2017, the plan he presented for the just energy transition was commended, and of course I imagine will be debated quite a bit by various groups, civil society included, but certainly a plan that may indeed be precedent setting. In your view, do you feel that we are still, I suppose, an important voice in the region, on the continent, globally as well? Previously we've had prominent South Africans hold very important positions. I think more recently would have been Dr. Phumzile Mlamangcuka at UN Women. We had Dr. Dlamini Zuma at the AU. We have Wamkele Nene now with the African Free Trade. But are we playing that leading role still, given the many challenges that we're facing domestically?
I mean, look, in 1994, when President Mandela became president, obviously South Africa was in a sort of storybook position in the world, and that could never last. It would last as long as him, and then it would end. But if you look in the last few years, I mean, I think the just energy transition, as you mentioned, is a sign of South African success on the international stage, that we're the precedent that everybody's looking to. I mean, it's a complicated process and it's not going to be perfect, but it's important, and South Africa is being seen as playing a constructive and important role in that regard. I think if you look during the COVID pandemic, the role that President Ramaphosa played in bringing resources to Africa, raising the profile of Africa's need around vaccines and the need for more open intellectual property rights around that, was a sign of how we can play a constructive role. I think, on the other hand, the fact that our economy is underperforming, et cetera, has weakened our position. I'm not sure that we have the same strong voice in the G20 and the BRICS that we had a few years ago. I think if you look at the way South Africa's, the position we've taken in regard to the war in Ukraine, it's problematic. And it's problematic not so much because we're trying to remain neutral and not take sides in that tragic conflict, but the way in which the government goes about explaining its position, which looks incoherent and leads other states to wonder what's really going on and to jump to conclusions which might be completely unwarranted given what South Africa's real interests are. So I think we're in a much more difficult situation than we were in the 1990s, and that South Africa has to pick carefully and prioritize its issues. I mean, it seems to me the effort that the government constantly makes about reform of the UN is really a wasted effort. The chances of the Security Council being reformed anytime soon is a pipe dream. On the other hand, the efforts of reforms in the World Bank and the IMF are on the agenda. Even today, the US government and Secretary of the Treasury Yellen is calling for reforms of the multilateral institutions. South Africa's voice could be a really important voice in making sure that those reforms consider the issues that are important to Africa. And so we do have the opportunities, and sometimes we've been really skillful in the examples I gave, and I hope that will continue going forward.
Thank you, Prof. Prof. Africa, let's take a forward-looking view as well about what some of the key things we need to begin to do in order to salvage or save, right, the prospects of the so-called Rainbow Nation.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I'd ever use the concept of a Rainbow Nation, but I think that what you are alluding to is that there have been some successes on the one hand, and as we are saying, we are failing in some respects, and we've even failed in others, in pockets, but we're not quite there at the precipice. I think that now, I suppose, we're meant to have been a post-apartheid state. We dismantled, or at least formally, those structures, but did we do that completely? No. The debate that's going around is whether we left, in fact, the economic structures intact. And I suppose that issue is really at the heart of what needs to happen next. How can we, without being overly deterministic, without being resorting to economic determinism, because I think there are many other things that are happening, but we do need to look at how we ensure that the very many millions of people who are on the peripheries of the economy, who don't enjoy equal access to education, to services as a result of that, the kind of structural impediments that are just being reinforced by this perpetual cycle, people migrating to the cities, not being able to access jobs, finding themselves living informally, not having access to health care, and these pressures also coming in from around our borders because people are equally enjoying those. It really suggests that we need a very fundamental reset in many respects. I do think that we need some very dramatic, and I know that government is trying through its economic and reconstruction development program, I think that's the name, to do that, but is this enough? I think that we need a different concept and view of who's included. So, for example, the micro enterprises, the small businesses, the creative economy, they are just so. And this requires then, for example, financial institutions to actually look at people differently. It probably requires us to stop and think about whether some of our debate about what to retain as state-owned enterprises and how to make them more effective as opposed to what is to be privatized, if at all, really need some sober discussion, because these may be the big initiatives that unlock the potential. But I think that we are increasingly, whilst having made some gains, we are increasingly a society where there are some who are within the circle of access to resources, to opportunities, and there's a growing number who actually aren't. And my view is that it is really because of structural impediments that this is the case. And so the question is, how do we undo those structural impediments?
Yeah. And just quickly, Prof, leadership is a key part to this as well, to make it happen. There's an important conference for the African National Congress in December. Might that, in your view, have any bearing of the direction the country takes, or do we wait for perhaps what the country decides in 2024? Coalition governments, we see how tricky they are in some big metros. Just the question around leadership and how that might steer or shape the direction the country takes.
Yes, I think that, the role of leadership is to provide some kind of vision. And of course that, we're a multi-party democracy. So there's leadership in the political sphere, in different political organizations. There's leadership in civil society, etc. I think that people, yes, indeed, do need to populate these spaces and infuse them with ideas which then can drive. So, but I think that vision is important. Government and some parties have been talking about social compacting. Well, it will require leadership across the board to actually buy into. A compact has to be agreed upon. But I think that it's only through it's through struggle as well, quite frankly, because very often things change as a result of struggle. Students who participated, for example, in Fees Must Fall would know that. So leadership takes different forms. It's about what you say, it's about what you do, and how you're able to rally people behind your cause and sustain the outcomes.
And Mr. Mokgotjana, before we open up to the audience, we touched briefly on the importance of a capable state, and a number of our institutions demonstrated resilience, right, even in the face of vitriol, of attacks. How do we protect institutions, and how do we build a capable state to deliver for its people?
Thank you. Before I get to that point, let me just echo what Danny said, just put it in perspective properly. I think we have to have an uncomfortable conversation in South Africa about why we seem to lose that space that we had. I mean, and think about it, for 10 years, we were talking Kandla, we were talking state capture,
yes.
Okay, apart from COVID and other challenges, and now we're talking Phala Phala. And we don't want to talk about those things. When the world was moving, we were busy grappling with these things. We were not focused. We lost the space. I can tell you, I was at the World Bank from around, what, 2004, 5, 2006, 2010. Critical time at the World Bank and the voice that I think we had. I was just in the board as a senior advisor, but I can tell you when we spoke, everyone listened in that board, and people reacted to us, and our statement was always reacted to because of the space that we had in those years, in earlier years. But then we lost the space. We lost the space in the continent, we're losing it, and we have to recover that lost ground. So let's focus, let's refocus. And I'm saying Kandla because we think about the fire extinguisher and the pool. We were having a conversation for many, many months. State captured a couple of billions later, 2.5 years. Pala, now every second day there's a story in Parliament, some about a committee and so. So the wrong things are being focused on. So it's important.
We can chew and walk at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? Call for accountability and do the other stuff.
Yes, but I'm just saying we're spending a lot of time, or maybe let me put it bluntly for you, because it's important, that let's just do the right things and forget about these things and focus on what matters for our people and for our including then finally for our continent and the space. And the voice that we have to be. I can tell you, I've been in that institution, both of them, the IMF and World Bank. When South Africa speaks, everyone listens. When Burkina Faso speaks, no one listens. And not because Burkina Faso, no, because, it just, I'm telling you, nobody listens. So if Janet Helen is taking this work on her, and then she's got a very strong voice from South Africa, and the focus here, we've got a backing from home. Because I had a backing at the time. When we negotiated the ESCOM loan, the first $3.75 billion, we had the full backing from the president, from the minister of finance at the time. We were moving. But anyway, let me go to this point that you're raising, which is very close to my heart. The institutions and building institutions. And in 25 years, we had 4 DGs at the Treasury. In 25 years. Maria Ramos came around 1998 or so? 97, 96, 97. And it was Lesecha, Lungis, and myself. And now Momo is acting. And we can say 30 years almost. Stability in the institution. Every other department, you'll have many DGs. What have we done to ourselves in the last 5 years? Because of the erosion of institutions. I had 4 ministers in 5 years in the Treasury. What do you think I was focusing on in the 5 years? Firstly, I must understand Malusi Gigaba and how he thinks. I must then go and understand Tito and how he thinks. Whilst I was still Nene also after Malusi. And then I must understand Enoch. So it tells you.
There was the weekend.
Yes. Oh no. Then I was not DG. I'm not talking because I was not DG. But these are the years when I was DG that, an institution is there, an important institution. I'm not saying the Department of Finance or Treasury is the most important, but it's a very significant department and we perform a very critical function like many others. I'm not saying others are not. But you mess up with that, you mess the institution up, and it's a pillar in our democracy, including the Reserve Bank, the judiciary, including other institutions of state. So, but think about when there was a shake, 450 billion gone in one weekend. Yeah. When you begin to tamper with we can tamper with the. We were accused of being neoliberal for many years, myself included. But you can attack us on that and let's argue that out. But don't tamper with the basis of the institution, because it's founded by some principles, some of them constitutional principles. So when you mess with that up, you actually shake the old institution apart, and then you can lose. And we lose. I mean, I go into the international market and raise money to fund that deficit I was talking about. But if we're doing wrong things and we are seen to be wobbly as a country, as a treasurer, as an institution, I'm there, I'm not trusted, and so on and so on. Excuse me, it's going to be very expensive. They'll give you money. BlackRock or whoever of these big guys will still give you money and buy your bonds, but they're not cheap. And you're going to pay forever. So for me, I think institution building and protecting institutions is important. You may not protect individuals, don't protect me. Protect the institution and the integrity of the treasury. Honesty is important. Corrupt-free environment is important in order for us to actually get legitimate people who should be leading these institutions. And not, I always said it, and it's important, and some of you in government will agree with me. When you join government, excuse me, it's a calling in South Africa. It's a calling, it's a higher calling. You're going to serve the public. But when you lose focus of that, before you can process that payment, someone must give you 10 rand. Before you can do this, someone must give you this. And we've seen that now. But because we are not alive to those things, we tend to lose focus on these big things that will keep us. We then argue things on the periphery. So my point, and the last point I'm making, is that let's preserve what we have, not people, the institution, the judiciary. You can attack, but don't attack what makes the judiciary in terms of the principles that are founded on. If you want to change the constitution, change it in the normal way. If you want to change the mandate of the National Treasury, excuse me, I will ask questions. You can be parliament, you can be president, you can be minister of finance. However, if we sit and we say, based on what we do and the work that we do, excuse me, there's no authority in law that I have to sign off this thing. I don't have it, and I can't. So, but if you force me to sign it, I will fight it out. Now you need resilience. You need people who are strong in principles in understanding their role, and not someone who's going to be just shaking because, and I'm not disrespecting the authority of the president or the authority of the minister of finance or the authority of cabinet. But remember, they can take decisions that are not in law. If a guarantee has to be given, Treasury we employ very smart young people who are smart. They are financial analysts. They are not political. They look at the request and they'll say yes or no. And if they say no, we don't think it's sustainable to give a guarantee because someone must pay for it. The institution, you're just putting it as a guarantee, but you must still pay for it. A guarantee is not a funding. It's not a funding arrangement. It's just a tool to assist. Now, but the authority, some minister will say, but I gave you an instruction to give this guarantee to X department or X state-owned company. I'm going to say, no, I can't. Based on what? I'm not despising the authority, but I'm just saying, but if you tend to lose and be shaky on principled matters, that's what we lose it. Yeah. Because you'll give guarantees that, what do they call it, contingent liabilities, meaning to talk to your debt, everything increases. So a responsible treasury should be a one that's resilient, a one that's tough, and a one that obviously has got the book and the law as its Bible. So sometimes we flinch and we forget that. And that's where now we tend to be wobbly as institutions and things fall apart because we don't take responsibly what actually the law empowers us to do.
Sure. Great. So let's open it up to our audience. I'm glad I'm already seeing the roving mics. May I see hands? We have one up front here. Two this side, and then a third. All right, I've noted those three, and then we'll take another round. Remember, joining us online as well, you can also post your comments. Remember to use that hashtag LeadUP conversation. There's already one question here. I'll read it in just a moment, but let's hear from the floor. Just straight to the point, please, your question, so we can take many. Go ahead.
So, can everybody hear me? Okay, so I feel, and thank you again to all of the panelists for presenting this conversation. It was exceptionally interesting. I just feel, in terms of this conversation, I feel that we detracted a bit. I feel that in my personal prerogative, this is not my field of expertise at all, I just feel that we didn't get to the point of whether South Africa is indeed a failed state or whether it is a failing state. I mean, there are certain things in South Africa, and I've searched some definitions on the internet in terms of especially scholars from the University of Peshawar and, Oxford, who see that failed states cannot provide the most basic services such as hospitals, education, and certain public services that it ought to, and that is where it considers to be a failed state. And in my experience and in my discourse with fellow academics and with other students, I find that especially when looking at Fala Fala or state capture, where President Zuma is constantly eluding the law, and in other, scandals and cases in Parliament, I feel that we are indeed not just a failing state, but in my relative understanding, especially taking into consideration what you referred to, that South Africa is also a third world country and is to be measured with that. My question is, what is our conclusion? Is South Africa a failed state? Is it a failing state? And what are we to do?
You want us to land somewhere. Please pass it on to the person in the red shirt. While the mic gets there, a question online, someone asks, given the emergence of clear signs of a failing state as presented by DG Dondo, what are the key interventions we need to urgently make to reverse the signs, both politically and technocratically? Please just make note of that one. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Jacqueline Kutze, former diplomat, currently in international trade. Okay, I think the biggest problem that we have in South Africa with our constitution was we gave too much power to the local and provincial governments. That was our biggest failure where we started. Then the other problem is there is no leadership. I mean, we have one leader in this country, the president, Cyril Ramaphosa. There is, if we honestly look at the rest of society, none of the political parties offer any real leadership. Business doesn't offer leadership. There are no physical leadership to take the country anywhere. Where do we find these leaders? And then the other problem that I had, I'm getting to the question now, is we never take responsibility. We had the whole issue of apartheid in South Africa. One person was sent to jail. None of the generals, none of the ministers, nobody took responsibility. We have how much corruption in this country now? Nobody ever takes responsibility. There's a strike or a riot like last year. People get killed. We lose 51 billion rand. Nobody is held accountable, not even the people who kill people there. What can we as South Africans at all levels, and this has to come at all levels of society. We cannot just say because I'm a housewife, because I'm a student, I'm in civil society. It has to come from all of us. If we want South Africa to not become a failed state, if we want to save our country, it's up to each and every one of us. And my question to the panelists is, what can we do as civil society, as government, as government, politicians, as academia? What can all of us do? Thank you.
Let's just take that third one. And please just short and sharp for me, please. I know academics in the room.
All right, thank you. My name is Josephine, and I think some of the people have already asked some of the questions that I wanted to ask. But my main thing is that, from what I gather, we are not a failed state yet, but there are red flags that are showing that we'll get there. My question is that, if nothing happens, there are no interventions, how soon are we to get there? You know, how soon will we get there? Is it in the next 5 years or 10 years? Because of there is a certain frustration is that we are not doing enough to make sure that we don't get there. But my question is that, what are we doing about the red flags? And if we don't do anything, how close are we to get there? Thank you.
Great question. How far or how close are we from it? Prof. Bradlow, do you want to take one or two of those to start?
Sure. I mean, those are all big, complicated questions, but a few points in response to all of them, I guess. In response to the first question on where we come down on whether South Africa is a failed state or not, this is where my distinction between a failed state and a failed government is important. I mean, if you use as your test, is the government delivering services to everybody? Is the legal system working as efficiently as it could? There's probably no state in the world that is anything but a failed state. There's no state that delivers well really meets the full potential to deliver the services and everything that it should to its citizens. The only thing I can suggest on that is I think human rights offers a good yardstick for determining some of these issues. It says the real test we have to use is what is the state delivering to everyone? What is the society delivering to everyone? Is everyone getting the things that they need to lead a life of dignity and opportunity? And how do we make sure that progressively is being realized? And it's important to recognize human rights only requires that be delivered progressively, because it understands it can't do it completely. So that in the answer to one question. The question on leadership and what do we as do? I think it's important also to we are a democracy. We're a functioning democracy. That means there's democratic space, and it's up to us as citizens to take full advantage of that democratic space, to vote, to raise our voices, to join civic organizations, to hold people accountable, our leaders accountable. And as was pointed out, it's not just a question of the government. The business community is failing to do what it should. They should be held accountable as well. And finally, is on the question of how soon might we reach it being a failed state. As I'm saying, I don't think we're on that path. We're certainly facing challenges, and some of those are of our own doing. But I think it's also important not to lose sight of the fact that we're functioning in a global context, and that the global situation imposes constraints which we need to recognize, and that we don't, without acting at an international level, have an opportunity to try and influence. Climate is an issue. The structure of the global economy is an issue. The geopolitics limits what we can do. And it's important, as we've said, that we take and operate effectively and try regain the status that South Africa had earlier, and do that not only as a country, but as part of the African continent, because I think that's the way our voice gains the largest resonance and attracts the most attention. But these are really complicated questions, and I think I'll hand over to my fellow panelists to go on about that as well. Thanks.
Prof. Bradley, thank you. Prof. Africa?
Okay. I think my starting point is that we are in a rapidly changing world, and yes, indeed, we have a constitutional state which has a very good architecture, that we have seen failures of leadership, we've seen failures of governance, and on the other hand, we've also seen a degree and instances where we are perhaps succeeding. But perception is everything. And the perception of many people, and as I've said, people who are somehow unable to access the goods that the state is meant to offer, is that it is failing them. And so our perspective should be that if the state is perceived to be failing by one person or a community, that's failure. So in that sense, we are failing. The state is failing vast swathes of its citizens. But I also think that there are very fundamental shifts that are happening geopolitically, in terms of the natural environment, in terms of the kind of societies that we are becoming. And so we also need to be adaptive. I think that many of our institutions are institutions of another time, of a time past. And we do need to start refreshing them. Of course, rupture and disrupture may not always be the way in which these changes come about. But as long as we can start to have the conversations about what should an education system look like, and pour the resources into doing that, what should a healthcare system look like? What should a new workload or work environment look like? These things are changing anyway. The question is who actually is part of that discussion, who's part of those initiatives. And I think that we need far more responsive policy that adapts to these changes which are in any case unfolding before our eyes.
Thank you. Former DG, a number of questions, take your pick. I'm quite interested in your response to the one about leadership in society.
First, let me start by saying our dream is under fire. That's clear. I mean, the topic, the topic today is this part of the dream is under fire. And we have to make sure that we extinguish that fire as soon as possible. And yes, I mean, you know, we don't have leaders anymore. And I don't know, I haven't been to a university campus in a long time. But I know in the 80s and late 80s and early 90s, student activism was at its height in terms of, and that's where many leaders were made and born and created. That, you know, ultimately became either leaders in our own right in the last 30 years or so, because of just the social structure that we were in at the time, because we had to survive, we had to ensure that we push our way forward, and then we are busy preparing to govern after '94. So then that's why people are quick to say, but the period between 1994 and 2004 was great for South Africa. And because you had a different type of a leader at the time and informed by the realities of the 70s and 80s. And now the challenge is you have an Amapiano generation now. And it's nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with it, but it looks like, you know, and think about the kind of leaders in local government today. It's the guy who is known to be an Amapiano guy in the local township. They help him to be in the branch of the DA or ANC or EFF. And then they are ward councillors or mayors or whatever, and they're in charge. They have never been exposed. All they know is that environment. And yet when we take a leader of yesteryear who was exposed in many ways, and we like shortcuts in South Africa, because the leaders are here. You have to go to a library. You have to pass a library. I don't, you know, for me, you have to go past the library. For you to have to be read in one way or the other to understand. You can naturally be intelligent. But the reality today is that there's very few people like that who have never been to school at all. But you have to be in a class like this, go to university, learn. But what kind of a leader do we have? And I'm not again talking, you know, out of my league here. But you engage and you see the kind of politicians we have who are supposed to be our leaders. And the kind of business people we have who may not have an understanding, limited understanding of what they have to do. And all of a sudden, look at most of the business people that took advantage of the COVID grant. And then, not the grant, it was actually loans from banks. They took the loans to address whatever they were doing, but the money just disappeared. And now they are indebted and they come and say, but the state is not assisting us. So the reality is that education, as I said in my initial, it's important because it gives you the basics. It just gives you the basics. And then you're able to then flourish. So leadership and again, holding each other accountable is an important thing. But there is a veil of secrecy nowadays, and I wrote it down. Let me read it. I wrote something down earlier on. You know, to show signs of a failing state is when matters remain unresolved and or are clouded with a veil of secrecy, uncertainty, and obliquity. Now, if that for me is again, it shows that no one is going to take responsibility and say, what happened here, and fire that person. And ethical leadership is lacking anyway. So
sure.
That's the reality of our time.
Let me take a few more questions. Were there any hands? So there are two right at the back. Let's start there. Two right at the back, and then we'll come down. Oh, and then all the hands go up. All right. Short and sharp, please, so we can get more people. Go ahead.
Yeah, can I speak? Okay, thank you. I'm going to be short. My name is Surprise. Thank you to the panelists. And I'm just going to relate to the first segment of the question, the dream under fire. So one of the dreams or the plan, SP, and in so far as the constitution is concerned, I'm particularly directing my question to the former DG on section 217 on public procurement, okay? So one of the plans, given the South African political context, through procurement is to advance people that were historically disadvantaged. So I think it's 2 months, if not 3 months back, there was a constitutional court case that basically said, I'm just paraphrasing here, that said National Treasury, particularly the 2017 regulation, National Treasury acted ultra vires out of their own scope to prescribe in a blanket to all state organs or state entities in terms of how their procurement must be and all those things. So currently, there's been a perception that the BBBE is being reversed and so on and so forth. So I just want to hear a perspective or comment about that. I read an article earlier today that there's a public procurement bill and apparently there's uncertainty as to whether by next year it's going to be in place. That is going to clarify as to how are state-owned entities and departments going to move on about the procurement. So I just want your comment on whether is there credence into the perception that there's a reversal of the BEE, or are state-owned entities empowered at the local level to deal with the question of BBBE? Thank you.
Yeah. Question. There was one more right up there.
Good evening. It's Obani Mtseto. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Okay, the first thing that I just really want to look at is just the theme itself. Is South Africa a failing state? That question. I think we have to revisit one thing. We were developing post-democracy itself, post the collapse of apartheid. Even during apartheid was the development to the total black majority, the poor black majority itself. So the question of whether South Africa is a failing state today, I don't think it's a recent question. It's something that we have to retrospectively analyze all the time. And also have to question the foundations our institutions are built on. What legacy do these institutions that we have today, where are they coming from, their origins, their bases themselves, what principles informed them before? Because if I'm not mistaken, according to Paul Pearson, in his arguments of part dependency, he argues that institutions are not entirely new. They can be reformed or reborn, but they're not entirely new. Previous decisions continue to replicate themselves, and actors would tend to reproduce the same results. So the results produced by government today, I don't think they're a major shock, because they were produced also by the apartheid government. Although the principles may appear new with our institutions currently, but the results and the outcomes, what are they producing? What are they informing us of? Especially in terms of policy directions. I mean, and I'm fine.
Okay, great comment. Just didn't want to lose the question along the way. There was just down here, down there. Yeah, let's take that one quickly and then get responses, please. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you so much. My name is Swana Khaswane. I'm a town planning student. So what I've learned today is that most of the things that were discussed were a failure to special justice, which is indicated in the SPLUMA, which is the Special Planning and Land Use Management Act. So this says that South Africa, indeed, I think it is a failing state because it is failing to address special justice, and it is failing to address, we have what we call a triple challenge, which is where we talk about poverty, unemployment, inequality. So I think they are failing to address such. So how about we usually talk about this in class, and I want to know your view about it, whereby we're like, how about we restructure, if it's restructuring or we're just adding another tier of government? We have 3 tiers, which is national, provincial, and local. So how about we add traditional authority? Because the traditional authority is about chiefs. They are there with people in poor areas, in rural areas. So how about these people become part of the government so that they can be able to influence the government, maybe because they know a lot, they are close to those people in rural areas. So I want to know your view about that. How about we add another tier of government so that we can say now we have national, provincial, local, and traditional? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Prof. Africa, please.
Okay, thank you. I just see these as contributions to the discussion, all very legitimate points and arguments for us to consider. But I'm going to leave the question about BEE and procurement to Dondo. But yeah, I mean, yes, I think the comment about the roots of these institutions, yes and no. You know, having served in institutions, in government where there were certain fundamental transformations, but at the same time, continuities with the old. That does require a lot of vigilance, political intelligence to be able to discern and to navigate those spaces so that you are able to prosecute your agenda. So you're right to some extent. But let's not forget the huge architectural shifts. We think back to the fallacy of the apartheid system and the rejection of that divide and rule. So we end up with one single defense force. Let me talk about the area that I teach, security studies, or one police force, or one intelligence architecture, one department of housing, the ability for people to move freely. So I think we should not underestimate that those changes were significant. But I really do like the comment about social justice, because it's and how we can actually deconstruct what this consists of. Yes, there remains spatial injustice, the poverty, the unemployment, inequality, very deep-rooted. Whether incorporating or whether, your proposed solution is, in fact, a new solution, I question, because, in fact, the traditional authorities are, in fact, provided for in our constitution, do have a formal status. Some would say they're not as resourced. Others would say, well, actually, they belong to a different era. But I think there's been a recognition increasingly, certainly from government, that we do need to actually take these structures that are closer to the people more seriously. And this, in some ways, is happening. There's always that debate about the confluence of modernity and tradition and the need to safeguard the erosion of rights, gender rights, for example, safeguard against those. But yes, these are part of our institutions, and we really do have the responsibility to look at how they are accommodated within the political space, more than formally, because they are, in fact, accommodated formally. So in that sense, I think that you've opened up a space for discussion. I often think that when we teach political science, we only talk about traditional structures. Perhaps we should be looking. And we're discussing the political science curriculum with colleagues from the University of Hawaii, and they were talking to us about how they have whole degrees in indigenous political systems. We don't have this, so perhaps we also need to be rethinking how we teach politics. We just witness things which are supposedly very interesting on TV when a king is crowned. But we don't actually know the history of those ceremonies in the local or the South African or the African context. So there's space for more diversity and inclusion, even in the way in which our syllabuses are developed.
Brilliant. Thank you, Prof. Africa. Prof. Bradler, over to you, and as you respond to the questions, if you could infuse your closing remarks as well, just in the interest of time.
Thank you. I mean, I think Prof. Africa gave an excellent response to most of the questions. I'm also going to leave the procurement question to Dondo to answer. I mean, I think the only thing I can add to what Sandy said is that we should not underestimate what occurred in 1994 with the change into democracy and the new constitution. It changed fundamentally many things. It certainly did not solve all the problems of our country. Could not do that. I mean, the history of 350 years of racism, colonialism, apartheid was too strong to be overcome in 30 years. But what the Constitution does do is it opens up space and allows discussions like the ones we're having tonight to happen. It creates ways and mechanisms for bringing about change and addressing the structures that exist and that need to be reformed. It's not the only way. The ways to do it are not easy. They're not always going to be linear and straight lines leading to that. And the answers are not always simple. You know, fighting apartheid was easy. The evil was clear. The enemy was clear. Now dealing with the problems of poverty, inequality, unemployment, climate, they're much more complicated in the sense that they're much harder to know what the correct responses should be. But the Constitution has given us the framework for at least having those discussions and moving the process forward. And I think we need to fully exploit the potential in the Constitution to do that. It's democracy, it's the legal system, it's civil society organizations. Students play a critical role in that, and tonight we can see that obviously is moving forward. I think one thing we've learned, and this is my concluding remark over the 30 years, is the Constitution is robust, it's resilient. We've made mistakes, there've been bad things that happened over the 30 years, but the state has survived and has grown, and institutions are being bedded down, and the potential for the future is there. We need to make our government live up to the potential that the state has and that it should develop in the future. And with that, I'll end and say thank you for a very thought-provoking discussion.
Thank you, Prof. Bradlow. Mr. Mokhajane?
No, thank you very much. I think the developmental project is not complete. It is actually starting. I mean, even after 25 or 30 years. We cannot give up. We cannot give up. That's just a general comment. I'm sorry, I'm going to disappoint a little bit on the procurement. All I can confirm is that 217 talks about transparent, fair, open process of procurement. I don't know what happened in the last 5 months. I think in the Treasury we've got a very nice tradition. When the DG of the Treasury leaves, Maria bought Lesetja a Mont Blanc pen. And Lesetja bought Lungisa a Mont Blanc pen. Lungisa bought me a Mont Blanc. I left it in a car. I must still buy. That's the only time we engage through that pen. So I don't know what happened in the last 5 months. I don't know how they engaged on this thing. But let me put in my head as chairman of GPF, Board of Trustees. I made a statement 2 months ago in Cape Town. I said, the transformation agenda is critical for us to advance as a fund. We will ensure as a fund that whoever we invest our money with, whoever we fund, should not put that in the back burner, including the financial sector, all sectors. And if you are not going to agree with us as a fund, we will give you money and you do your own thing. You will fall off the GPF bus. That's what I said. What did I mean by that? I said, essentially, I was simply saying, the banks, the financial institutions, industry, everyone we fund or we assist through or invest in through the PIC, we cannot put transformation behind us, including black economic empowerment. That's what I said there. So now, if you're saying that BE, my view is still the same, that says the transformation agenda is not complete in South Africa. Transformation should still be at the center. Now, and I don't understand the basis of where the Ministry of Finance comes with this, and so but on the procurement side, it was more about, separating the organs of state and our powers and so on, and saying each organ of state must have its own procurement project. So it was that, so we are focusing more on the responsibility of the accounting officer in each organ of state. That was more the changes that the court forced us to do last year when I was still there. But I think it's important that we don't forget transformation. We don't forget that our own history of South Africa said black people were disadvantaged and that we have to advance black people. But we cannot do that recklessly, and we cannot do that in a way that we marginalize white people. I think I'm being blunt here. We've got a 24-year-old white male or white female who does not know anything. So you cannot disadvantage again those that are born of democracy. But the reality is that right at the high level, in terms of what we need to do, we must know that we have to make sure that equality and inequality that we experienced during the apartheid is addressed. The apartheid city, that's what you're talking about. When you talk about spatial, I forgot exactly what you said, but you're mainly talking about the apartheid city mentality, which is still there, whereby Soweto and Soshanguve and Atteridgeville were domains of labor into the city. And that mentality went through with us till today, whereby we don't recognize, and as Cindy and Sandy says, how do we then ensure that we modernize our institutions and the way we deliver for our people? So again, it's a challenge that I think you are giving all of us to think through. How do we look at the role of traditional leaders, and how do we look at that sector and actually make sure that we advance the interest? There's a model, and it started when I was still a budget analyst for KZN, where the royal household became a vote in the KZN budget. So you've got a vote, education, health, whatever, and you also have some department called royal household, where the funding of the king is coming from there, funded by the KZN government. Now, is that a model to use? I don't know. But it's recognizing, and that's why you see a little bit of difference in terms of the advancement of some of the rural areas in KZN, because there's a specific budget that government had vis-a-vis the others. So, but again, it's how we have to look at new challenges that emerge now in really addressing the apartheid city mentality.
Colleagues, we are already 10 minutes over time, and I appreciate your indulgence. I know there are many questions we didn't get to, but we have an opportunity to further the conversation outside. There are some refreshments, so I do ask that we take the conversation there. A round of applause for our panelists, please. Thanks to all our panelists. Thank you to everyone watching and who's engaged us online. Please, of course, do follow us online so that you have a sense of upcoming LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership conversations, which will resume in 2023. Today's event was brought to you by the University of Pretoria's Alumni Relations team. I am Sewenzile Nkambule. Good evening.
There are some places that will always be home. From the moment you took your first step onto the University of Pretoria's campuses, you've been part of our family. You've made friends, had a good time, fallen in and out of love, passed tests, failed some dismally, and started businesses. You had some great ideas. All the while, you made memories and learnt a lot. But in the end, you walked out of our gates a well-rounded person, someone committed to excellence. You still get things done the right way the first time. You've learned the value of innovation, mentoring, having a positive impact, and living a life based on strong morals, ethics, hard work, and responsibility. At the University of Pretoria, we're proud to call you part of our family. We're proud to be your alma mater, and we'd be delighted if you wanted to choose UP again to further your studies. Because even though we're the largest residential research university in South Africa, we're still your home. One thing we've learned over more than a century is that excellence is forever. We're still adamant in the high quality of our teaching and learning, and in the graduates that we produce. The more things change, the more they stay the same. UP will always be the home of Tux alumni.